Welcome to another 5-minute video from the Museum of Aquarium and Pet History. Today we're going to talk about pet mice, and we're going to show you some of the cages that we have, some of the cage artifacts that are in the museum collection. All right, let's get started. All right, one of the oldest cages that we have in the museum archives is this mouse cage right here, probably from about 1840s to 1850s. It is definitely, they call it folk art, but honestly, I think this was a minimal production cage. They probably made maybe 50 of these back in the 1840s, 1850s, because it's very well made. This was quite a craftsman. It's got the little exercise wheel, it's got his living quarters here, and it's got the little sleeping area right here, which is really cool. Has a pin on it, and the mouse would sleep in there. And I know sometimes you'll say, well, these look pretty small for a pet mouse. Well, you got to remember, back in the 1800s, people didn't have iPhones, televisions. They didn't even have electricity. So most kids worked on the farm. Most young women worked with their moms, or they had jobs actually from age 13. And when they came home, the first thing they did was pull out their pet mouse, put it on their shoulder, and walk around the house with it. So the mouse did get a lot of outside exercise outside of this cage. All right, so that's the oldest one that we have. We have another one that's also very old and very tiny, this little tiny cage. And it has a little screw that goes in there, and you can open it up, and your mouse would be in here, and you would sprinkle some food in there for him. And of course, during the day, probably, or when the little boy or girl came home, the mouse would come out and go on their shoulder and cruise around the house with them. Okay, that's a very tiny one. Another one of my favorites, has this little old American flag on it, and this is pressed steel. So this was a production cage. It's got a little metal door that the mouse would go in. It's got a great design to it, you know, with this little mouse wheel. Now, mice have been kept since, 1100 BC, and they were domesticated at least 15,000 years ago. So mice have one of the longest domestication histories for a small animal, as opposed to, say, hamsters, which came from Syria and weren't domesticated until 1938 in the United States, and gerbils till 1954. So just to show you, mice have been around for a long time as domesticated pets. And that's a little, I call it the American flag mouse cage, pressed steel. It's not signed, so I don't know who the manufacturer would have been, but that's a very cool one. Another one that we have, and this one is signed, this is Lindemann. Lindemann made several different mouse cages. Again, this is pressed steel. It's got a little shelf on top. It's got the Lindemann insignia on the door, and you basically move the wire in and the door opens up like that. So that's the, got the little wheel. Another very cool little mouse cage from O.L. Lindemann and Company that lasted from about 1850s, early 1850s until about 1920s. In the 1920s, they either went bankrupt or they were bought out by Hendryx. And Hendryx kept their profitable items. It's in their repertoire, and they got rid of the ones that didn't sell, that were basically outdated. And then another very unusual one would be this one right here. This is another Lindemann cage, probably older than that one there. This one's probably 1870s, and that's probably 1880s to 1890s. And it has the Lindemann insignia on it. It has a little area here with a little shelf that they can crawl up on. They would sprinkle the food on the shelf for them. And again, the mouse would come out during the day and be on the shoulder of the little boy or girl that had the pet mouse. And last but not least, if you want to jump up to like the 1950s, 1960s, predominantly 60s, this is a galvanized cage. This same style of cage was made by Hendryx and actually imported for a few other companies. I believe this is American made, actually. Probably the last American made mouse cage was, as far as metal ones go, was a cage like this. And you have little steps going up to the top shelf. You've got the little mouse exercise wheel. So again, there's a more modern day cage. And if you're thinking about a mouse for a pet, we will leave some, like the American Fancy Rat and Mouse Association, we'll leave that at the end of this video. Just a few little interesting things about mice. Mice can empathize. They can communicate through facial expressions. They're well organized, tidy, and clean. Incredibly clean and organized. Sounds like my wife. The whiskers can help them sense temperature changes. They can play dead. The male mouse can sing a song while courting a mate. Pretty interesting. That's kind of cool. And they're one of the most talkative rodents, and they eat between 15 and 20 times a day. Sounds like me and my snacking. In 1895, there was a National Mouse Club, and there actually was one in England and one in the United States, probably Germany as well. So there's been organized clubs for mice since the late 1800s. And that really is all I have to say about pet mice. So I hope you liked it, and hope you enjoyed some of the artifacts that we have in the Pet Museum. Thank you, and see you again.